Growing up, many kids harbor dreams of playing sports professionally. I know I did. But eventually almost all of us have that moment where we realize that we're just not skilled enough to make the cut and have to give up on our dreams. But what if you realized you weren't good enough to play sports professionally, but you never gave up the dream? Carlos Kaiser wasn't like the rest of us, and he refused to give up on his dream of a career in football. Despite having no real football talent, Carlos was able to con, lie, and manipulate his way into a decades-long professional football career, all while never playing in a single game. Carlos's fraudulent career saw him earn contracts at some of the biggest teams in Brazil, while living the high life and rubbing shoulders with some of Brazil's finest footballers and finest women. This video tells the crazy story of football's biggest con man and the wild tales from a football career where the main aim was to avoid playing football so his lack of skill wasn't exposed. From fighting with fans, to faking injuries, to impersonating football legends and encounters with Brazilian gangsters, this video has it all. So join me as we recap the life and stories of the legendary con man Carlos Kaiser, the best footballer to never play football. Before we dive into the video, be sure to hit the like button if you enjoy the video, as it massively helps the channel, and subscribe for more sports documentaries just like this one. Let's go. The story of football's greatest con man began when a 16-year-old Carlos Kaiser had trials with Mexican team Puebla, but Carlos failed to impress the coaches and was released. After having his dreams shattered, Carlos had the all too familiar realization that while he was a decent footballer, he was absolutely not good enough to be a professional footballer. But he also loved the lifestyle of a professional footballer too much to just walk away from the lifestyle of partying and women. And this was the moment where he decided to do whatever it took to live the lifestyle of a professional footballer without being able to play football. To forge his fraudulent football career, Carlos devised a plan to infiltrate the upper echelons of Brazilian football, and he began frequently attending some of the most famous nightclubs in Rio de Janeiro, where Brazilian footballers often partied. As with every other successful con man, Carlos was extremely charismatic and likable, and he had a skill for forming bonds with just about anyone. And before long, Carlos was friends with some of the most famous footballers in Brazil, such as Alberto and Zico. Having this extended network of footballers as friends meant Carlos had a huge number of people with influence in football, and he used this influence to land his first professional contract with Brazilian giants Botafogo. Now Carlos had earned a professional contract, he would have to do anything to avoid playing football, otherwise his lack of talent would be exposed and he'd be released. It was here he deployed what would become his signature tactic of avoiding playing football by pretending to be injured constantly, with his go-to injury of choice being a fake hamstring tear that would keep him sidelined for months. While Carlos recovered from his injuries, he'd be unable to train and would focus on his other two passions in life, partying and women. It was while focusing on partying that Carlos would show just how good he was at making the friendships that allowed him to convince so many professional teams to sign him. While out partying, Carlos had got into the habit of impersonating Brazilian football legend Gaucho to impress the ladies, to the point he even began cutting his hair to look more like the star. Kaiser claims that doing this helped him to sleep with a lot more women, and boasts that in his life he has slept with over 1,000 women. However, eventually his impersonation of Gaucho was about to be exposed when Gaucho himself arrived at a nightclub only for security to tell him that his name had already been ticked off of the guest list. Gaucho was eventually let inside of the club, and when he arrived at his VIP table, he found Kaiser pretending to be him and with a bunch of women at the table. However, instead of exposing Kaiser and demanding he be thrown out by security, Gaucho was instead amused by Carlos Kaiser, and the pair somehow ended up becoming really good friends, meaning Carlos had made yet another powerful friend in football. Carlos earned contracts by getting his friends in football to vouch for his football ability. Well, that, or he just outright lied to teams. Carlos had a history of paying journalists to write glowing articles about his skills that he would then show to teams. Once he'd signed for a club, he would train with the team, but mysteriously always be unable to play in matches, with a wide variety of excuses. Carlos would also charm his teammates and organise parties with plenty of women, so that his teammates were more likely to stick up for him if his injuries were to be questioned. He would also even pay fans to chant his name so the club manager could hear. Whatever it took to reduce suspicion about him, Carlos would do it. As soon as a club started to become a bit too suspicious of his injuries and questioned his ability, Carlos would be quick to leave the team and move on to the next one. Some of the ways Carlos would dodge actually playing in matches included faking dental issues with the help of a dentist friend who would produce any medical notes Carlos required. Another method saw Carlos pay a youth team player to make a really bad tackle on him so that he could then again pretend to be injured and take advantage of the lack of medical expertise present in 1980s Brazilian football, meaning he could milk the injury for as long as possible. Another favourite tactic deployed throughout his career was to claim his grandmother had passed away whenever a manager came close to picking him to play. This guy went through, I think, about 14 grandmothers by the sounds of it. However, these excuses pale in comparison to the finest moment of Carlos's conman career, where he managed to dodge playing football at the very last minute. After leaving Flamengo, Carlos had earned himself a contract with Rio-based team Bangu. Bangu was at the time owned by one of Brazil's most dangerous gangsters in Castor de Andrade, who allegedly had links to Colombia's infamous Cali cartel. Andrade was definitely not a man you wanted to piss off and lie to, but the owner actually loved Carlos despite Carlos always being injured, and the players at Bangu all stuck up for Carlos whenever his injuries were questioned, as he was the one in charge of organising the parties for the players. While at Bangu, Carlos even paid off the ball boys to get the fans to chant his name, to give his owner the impression that the fans also loved him. However, eventually Bangu's gangster owner had had enough of not seeing his star striker playing, and he ordered the manager to put Carlos on the bench for the game the next day. The news of his spot on the bench tomorrow was delivered to Carlos at 4 AM in a nightclub. However, he'd been assured that he would only be a non-playing substitute, and therefore wasn't worried about being exposed. This promise not to play fell apart when Bangu were 2-0 down after just 8 minutes, and the owner got on his walkie-talkie to tell the manager to sub Kaiser onto the pitch as soon as possible. Carlos began to warm up and began getting increasingly nervous as he realised he was about to out himself as a fraud in front of one of Brazil's most dangerous men. However, he found a way out when he received abuse from the opposition fans while warming up. Carlos quickly jumped over the fence and began fighting with the opposition fans who had abused him, which led to him getting a red card before ever setting foot onto the pitch. At half-time, Bangu's owner was absolutely furious and he stormed down to the dressing room to confront Carlos. But Carlos lied to him and told him that he'd only attacked the opposition fans because they'd been calling the owner a drug baron and a murderer. And Carlos couldn't stand for that and had to defend Andrade's honour because he viewed the owner as the father figure he'd been missing since his dad died when he was 13. Unbelievably, Andrade responded by giving Carlos Kaiser a kiss and extending his contract for 6 months on the spot. Carlos's career as a fake footballer was littered with stories like this. While at Brazilian giants Fluminense, one of Carlos's teammates had knocked somebody out in a nightclub. Without hesitation, Carlos took the blame and the punishment, and in return his teammates battled for the club to give him a contract extension. Everywhere he went, he was beloved, and in a film made about his life, the documentary makers said of everyone they'd interviewed about Carlos, not one of them had a bad word to say about him. Such was his infectious personality. The list of teams Carlos earned contracts from reads like a who's who of Brazilian football, particularly of the clubs based in Rio de Janeiro. His career even saw a brief stint in America in El Paso, as well as a short stint in France at Auxerre. When Kaiser was unveiled at Auxerre and hyped up as a dynamic Brazilian striker, he booted all of the balls at his presentation to the fans in the stands, so he could avoid having to try and juggle the ball or show off any of his skills. His time in France was brief, but he made sure to get pictures taken of him in the kit, which he would then use in Brazil to earn more contracts by claiming he'd played in France for 8 years and had been a star striker. Another tactic used to earn contracts by Carlos was to take grainy VHS footage of goals scored by someone who looked like him and had a similar name, and pass that footage off as himself to unsuspecting teams. Not all of Carlos's contracts were earned by deception. Rio-based club Vasco da Gama handed Carlos a contract to help one of his teammates overcome issues with alcoholism. Despite how often Carlos partied, he didn't actually drink and was able to help steer his Brazilian international level teammate away from the booze. Nowadays, Carlos is almost 60 and says he regrets his fraud football days and wishes he worked harder to try and become a legitimate professional footballer. He has issues with his sight, has converted to Buddhism and works as a personal trainer in Rio for female bodybuilders, and he specifically specified that he does not train men. The legacy of Carlos Kaiser is a complicated one, for me at least anyway. On the one hand, living a large portion of your life as a con man and lying your way from club to club is very dishonourable. On the other hand, I'd be lying if I said I don't envy his life of partying with footballers and beautiful women in the clubs of Rio de Janeiro. It's hard to respect a con man, and yet as someone who also sucked at football, I kind of respect that he never let his lack of ability stop him from having a football career. Additionally, nobody seems to have a bad word to say about Carlos despite the fact he lived a large portion of his life as a con man. I'd be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on the legacy of Carlos Kaiser in the comments down below. Is he someone to admire, or is his legacy ultimately a shameful one? That's all for this video. If you enjoyed, please smash the like button to help the channel and subscribe for more sports stories just like this. If you have video suggestions, drop them in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.